Welcome to the Life Works Living Well podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hennick. Over 20% of the population will experience a substance use disorder or addiction at some point in their lifetime. And certainly the COVID-19 pandemic has only made matters much, much worse. Now, the consequences, of course, can be devastating, both from long-term misuse of substances, but as well as the acute crises of overdoses and trauma. Yet, with the right supports, we know that recovery is likely for most people, and there's even a few who might even go on to use their experiences for good, to help and to inspire others. Over the next 2 episodes of the Life Works Living Well podcast, we're going to be exploring a few of the many perspectives that there are on addiction, from neuroscience and the biological basis of addiction to novel interventions and indeed personal experiences. On today's episode, I'll be talking with Dr. Jennifer Brasch. Dr. Brasch is a psychiatrist in Hamilton, Canada, where she specializes in concurrent disorders. She's the lead on addiction psychiatry for St. Joseph's Healthcare in Hamilton, and she's the president of the Canadian Society of Addiction Medicine. But first, Allan Kehler is a mental health advocate, an author, an experienced speaker, and a wellness coach. It's a career that he built from perseverance through the lifelong effects of mental illness, addiction, trauma, and suicide. Al shares his story with us today about his recovery from addiction and the life that he's been building ever since. Here's my interview with Allan Kehler. This is Living Well, and I'm Mark Hennick.
Mark, happy to be here.
So I've followed your work for a while on social media, but I'm not really all that familiar with the details of your story, of what's brought you into the mental health work. I know we have a lot in common, so I'm hoping that for my benefit, but also the benefit of our viewers and listeners today, you can tell us a bit more about what got you into the mental health and addiction space.
Mark, the reality is, here's the short and sweet. I spent so much of my life trying to harm or kill self. And there is no logical reason why I should still be vertical after the life that I've led, other than I feel like I am simply here to deliver a message. And I do so with so much gratitude, so much humility. And you and I, and I'm sure the listeners know that nobody grows up hoping to one day become an addict. I didn't grow up hoping to struggle with mental illness. And I didn't grow up hoping to be a motivational speaker either. But I grew up in like this small town, small 4.5 roads. And I could always be seen with a smile on my face. My identity was formed very quickly as somebody who excelled in academics, in athletics. The world was basically just my stage. You know, what people saw on the outside was so different than what was taking place on the inside. And I always hid behind that proverbial mask, the smile. And the short and sweet is I was in a lot of pain, but I didn't know how to talk about my pain because I didn't talk about my pain. Then, who suffered more than anyone else? Obviously, me. My challenges with mental illness, body dysmorphic disorder really started when I was in grade 8. And then they just continuously escalated. There was a moment, Mark, where I was finally able to get the help that I so desperately needed. And man, I was put on a combination of 12 different pharmaceutical pills in 6 years. I was hammered with so many different labels from psychiatrists. I had no relationship with myself. So every label, I was like, oh, that's who I am. And I just ingested it. I wore it. I lacked the tools to manage the pain. So I grabbed at straws. I mean, alcohol was right there waiting for me with open arms. I turned to self-harm. I was a compulsive gambler. I ran around the whole world. And I mean, get this, you cannot run away from self. Go figure. I tried. You reach a point where you find out very quickly that, if you want something different, you're going to have to do something different. And my battles with mental illness and addictions, I hit so many of those proverbial lows. One of them, Mark, was where I was an educator. I was teaching on a field placement in Edmonton, teaching at a junior high school, special ed. And I walked out of the classroom and I just collapsed. I collapsed in the hallway. And I remember all these my students are peering over me. They're like, oh, Mr. K, are you okay? And once again, I just smile, and I say, oh yeah, no, everything's good. Everything was not good. I had been given a month to live from a doctor if I didn't change what I was doing. And I knew that. But I always said, like, what is this? There has to be more to life. There just has to be. And what ended up helping me more than anything was understanding the power that comes with being vulnerable. Being vulnerable was so hard for me. But eventually, Mark, I was able to get myself into bipolar support groups. I got myself into Gamblers Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous. Man, those things were so hard because I had to leave, ego at the door. I had to swallow my pride. I had to look at myself, but it was also so liberating because I started to hear my story through others. And because of that, I realized, what? I'm not alone. Oh, man, I'm not alone. And it had to do with those two words, the me too, the connection. Now, when I was given that month to live, sadly, that didn't stop all those self-destructive behaviors. I was so fortunate, Mark, to meet a woman named Tanya who had 2 boys. And this was the game changer of my life, where I meet these kids. And Mark, they loved me for me. And I was like, what is this? What? I feel like I don't have to wear this mask. And I was 3 months sober when I moved from Edmonton to Saskatoon in with Tanya and her 2 kids. And I did not have a lot to offer. But this was a moment, Mark, where, sometimes in our life, we need others to believe in us more than we believe in ourselves. And Tanya taught me about love, about respect. She said, in this house, we're moving forward. We're done with the addiction. She didn't give me an out, and I needed that. It was the tough love approach. And man, Mark, like my life today could not be more different. To be able to have a home, not a house, to be able to have, a beautiful wife that I love, 4 healthy kids, be in a position where my story can help others. It's very hard to wrap my head around, but I'm far from religious. I'm very spiritual, and it's just use me. I'm here, use me.
Yeah, our stories have so many intersecting points. Like there's so many commonalities, and there's a danger in that. And I want to talk to you in a second about how there can be a danger in assuming that because I did it, you can do it too, right? Everybody is different. But before we get into that work, what you've been using with it, you mentioned something that I'm curious about. How much of your identity as a boy in 8th grade, becoming a man, that culture of masculinity, how much of that played into your struggles with being vulnerable, with dealing with your appearance, your body? What's the connection with masculinity here? I feel like there is one.
There's one, Mark. I mean, I didn't grow up seeing men being vulnerable. I didn't see men shedding a tear, reaching out for help. So therefore, why would I? So I suppressed everything. It took me a long time to understand that emotions are energy. And that's why as soon as I started talking about it, I felt better. Well, go figure. Everything you're talking about, Mark, was the very reason that I wrote the last book on men and mental health, because to your point, I wanted to figure out the why. Why is it that headlines still to this day will read, women seek help, men die? And what I found more than anything is all of us as men have very similar fears of what might happen when we do reach out for help, society's perceptions. But what trumped everything is every single man, myself included, said that when they finally reached out for help, they felt free, liberated, like they no longer had to hide behind that proverbial mask. Mark, that's what you and I and so many others essentially do. Show that vulnerability is not a weakness, but rather that vulnerability equals strength.
And relearning, I think, in so many ways, what it means to actually be a man, what masculinity is supposed to be, if there even is a supposed to. But I think so many of us learned an almost pathological, toxic masculinity, or at least we're surrounded and suffocated by it from a very young age, that it tells you that it's not okay to cry, that it's not okay to show your emotions. And as we know, of course, that you can't just stuff that stuff down, that you can't just push it away, that it comes out in all sorts of other ways. Now, you've experienced and have worked with in the past people who have used, who have had addictions, who have used substances, misused substances to try to, I think, escape something. There's always an element of escape to it in your work as an addiction counselor. So tell me a bit about that transition from somebody who had themselves experienced a mental health problem, a mental illness, addiction themselves, then to go on and, I assume, use that experience to help others who have gone through similar experiences. Tell me more about what that was like for you.
Mark, I don't usually go down this rabbit hole, but here is the truth. Remember, I said I was 3 months sober when I moved in with Tanya. My job right away, 3 months sober, was being hired at an inpatient treatment facility. Nobody knew. Nobody knew. I mean, I had already been speaking, being a motivational speaker around problem gambling for a long time. I didn't even actually connect the dots that I was an alcoholic till, shortly before working at the treatment center. So really, it was a case of the blind leading the blind. I learned how to get sober by being a counselor. And more than that, Mark, I actually got hired to teach at a college. I was teaching a youth care worker program. I was teaching them how to be addictions counselors 3 months sober, the very course that I had dropped out of as a student 2 years previous, which to me, it's like, what? So much of it, when we're in this world of addiction, it's this manipulation, it's the facade, the mask, the lies. And so I look back and I'm like, wow. First, I don't recommend, taking that path, but it was a time where I didn't have boundaries because those were taken from me at an early age around abuse, sexual abuse. And I was so unhealthy, but I was so, I'm an empath, I'm somebody who it's like, what, you're in pain? Let me take that from you. But then I got sick and it was one hell of a journey. The experience of being a counselor, it taught me so much. Man, we're so quick to judge, aren't we, in our society when it comes to addiction? And you and I, and I'm sure the listeners know that it just comes down to pain. There's so much pain. That's what stood out for me as a counselor right away. At the root of it, everybody's in pain. They don't have the tools to manage the pain. It is logical to want to leave pain behind in exchange for pleasure. And my definition of addiction is pretty simple. It's a way to live outside of self so that we don't have to be with self. It is so hard. It was so hard for me learning to stop being angry, to stop projecting and give myself permission to feel and to finally buy into the fact and guide my clients through this understanding that feeling is what leads to healing.
Yeah, that link, I think, between trauma in particular and addictions is pervasive, that we're all struggling with the present moment. And I think in many ways, the last 2.5 years or whatever it's been of this pandemic has shown us how hard the present can be, right? We all look for ways of escaping, but some people sometimes, for a variety of reasons, whether they are genetic or biological or social, certainly issues of marginalization play in here, they get stuck in that loop and in that spiral and keep spiraling down. So then how do you find, psychotherapists are trained in the safe and effective use of self, right? How much of myself that I'm putting into this is for me, and how much of it is for the benefit of the other person? How did you negotiate or learn over time to negotiate that boundary between your stuff and their stuff, either as a counselor or just in everyday relationships?
Yeah, it's hard. And, even as a counselor, I took their stuff home. And I had a very hard time separating other people's pain from my pain. Like I said before, I ingested it. I remember I had an elder who said, you have no right to take this on. They have their journey and you have yours. Mark, that was a lesson actually after I lost my best friend to suicide, because that was a time where I was so consumed by it. And I find that we can become so enmeshed in the journey of others. And to the elder's point, it's like, you cannot take ownership over the actions of others. It was very much learning how to surrender the things that are outside of our control. There's a great proverb, let go or be dragged. And there's only so much that we can do for the people around us who are in pain. And a lot of times we have like this front row seat to a horrific show where we watch our loved ones struggle. And really, it does come down to, you can only say and do so much, and then you have to surrender. And that has been a very hard lesson for me. When I was teaching people how to be counselors for years, it really came down to that self-care piece. How do you not take on others' journeys? And people who get into the field are ones who genuinely care, but you find out very quickly that it's not sustainable. There was a time where I remember coming home from a shift at the treatment center, and I remember Tanya, my wife, stopped as she was about to go downstairs, and she said, "I need a husband and our kids need a father." That, Mark, was the moment where I realized I'm giving way too much away here, and I had to really step back and think about, where do I want to spend my time and energy?
So now you've been working on, for the last few years, coaching, speaking, sharing your inspirational message with others who need it in bigger and bigger ways. You're an author, of course, you've written. So tell me about that experience, making the transition now to these bigger things and sharing your story in such a compelling way.
Yeah, there is. I have such a twisted sense of gratitude, Mark, for the things that I've endured. I wish that I had known that this was at the end of all those struggles, because you and I meet with so many people who are at that proverbial fork in the road where they're ready to check out. I was there, and it's redemption. It's redemption. It's a journey, but wow, is there power when people can approach us or send an email and say those two powerful words, "Me too." And it's like, whoa, hang on. If my story has the potential to assist someone else, why would I ever be quiet? I feel like one of the greatest tragedies is when people go 6 feet under without having taken the opportunity to share their story. Our soul needs to express it as much as people need to hear it. And the books, Mark, were always bigger than me. I never planned to write them. It was so weird. This sounds messed up, but it's like, even the last book that I wrote, I was shoveling snow on the driveway. It felt like someone hit me over the head with a shovel. And the whole book went poof, just poof. And I ran inside, typed the skeleton. The men appeared. I interviewed all of them. 9 months later, done. I am simply like this, I don't know, channel between whatever's on the other side. And I have no goals. Like I said before, it's just use me. And that's always my prayer.
I have over the years had so many people come to me and ask me how they can advocate for mental health awareness or do what we do, that sort of thing. And, I'm the first one to admit that my advocacy work has been integral to my own recovery. That, like you, sharing my story, doing the work while still struggling sometimes, while occasionally relapsing and rebuilding and all that stuff, that my advocacy has been important to that. But even still, I think that one of the first things that you need to do in order to advocate more for mental health is to take care of yourself. Get your own house in order, at least just enough. You don't got to be perfect. You don't got to figure yourself out in order to change the world. The two things happen together. But you do need to put yourself first in a way to start to get your own, at least, thoughts in order. What would you suggest to the people who come to you and say that they want to do what you do, that they want to advocate to change the mental health system, to raise awareness? What do you tell them?
Off you go. Off you go. We are our greatest barriers. But here's the other thing. People want what you and I are doing. They want to have that audience, but they don't always see the work that it took, like the work behind the scenes. Having said that, it doesn't mean that you can't pick up a phone and tell a bit of your story. Social media has a bad rap, and sure, there's a lot of unhealthy things on there, but it can also be a beautiful, beautiful platform. Mark, the thing that I love right now is how many people are being so open and transparent about their sobriety, about their recovery, about their challenges with mental illness. I started going to these, 12-step programs, and sure, it helped me because I felt understood. But if everybody was anonymous, we would be in a world of hurt. And I love that more and more people are shedding the anonymity and just saying, hey, this is what I've gone through. What? You too? Connection. And it's this beautiful ripple effect. There is nothing more powerful than our voice. So short and sweet, empower people to use their voice.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to make mistakes along the way too, safely, ideally. But I don't know about you, but I've figured this out as I'm still many years into it, figuring it out as I go. So I think you have to be open to that. Anyway, thank you so much. I could talk to you for so much longer, but unfortunately, we do have to wrap up. That's all the time we have. Allan Kehler is a mental health advocate and author. He's an experienced speaker and wellness coach. What's the name of the book, or your most recent book that you mentioned there?
That one's Mental Health. It's Time to Talk.
It's Time to Talk. And where can people find out more about you?
Good old Google, or just go to ALLANKEHLER.com. If I can be of assistance, then definitely holler.
Al, thanks so much for being on the LifeWorks Living Well video podcast. Talk to you again soon.
See you, Mark.
Thank you so much to Allan Kehler for that incredible conversation about his personal experiences and the amazing work that he's doing in this space. We're going to be right back in the LifeWorks Living Well podcast with Dr. Jennifer Brasch.
In our changing world, there is an unchanging principle for success that inspires us. By improving a person's life, we'll improve how they perform at work. We are LifeWorks. We are the world's leading total well-being provider. We are innovators with tech-enabled solutions. Our mission is to improve people's lives by supporting the whole person, their mental, financial, physical, and social well-being. These people are the heart of successful organizations, leading these organizations to a more resilient future and making a real difference in the world and in our communities. Improving lives, improving business. We are LifeWorks.
Welcome back to the LifeWorks Living Well podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hennick. I'm joined now by addiction psychiatrist and lead in addiction psychiatry for St. Joe's Hospital in Hamilton, Dr. Jen Brasch. Jen, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for the invite.
So I wanted to have you on the show, particularly on this episode, of course, about addictions, about substance-related disorders, because there's so many different perspectives on this, not only personal, but professional. There's many ways of approaching both the diagnosis and treatment of addictions. I'm interested in unpacking with you the addiction psychiatry perspective. You're also the president of the Canadian Society of Addiction Medicine, so you probably know more about this than most. What is the biological basis or the medical basis of addiction, according to your specialty?
I think there's growing appreciation that there absolutely is a biological basis to addiction. Interesting work in genetics showing that people have a predisposition, or some people, to a certain different types of addictions. Certainly the influence of environment or epigenetics on development of an addiction. For example, if a woman smokes during pregnancy, her child is far more likely to smoke herself or himself when they reach that age. But certainly growing appreciation, and not only for genetics, but that as people use substances, it leads to changes in the brain. What first may be an impulsive or voluntary act, the use of substances leads to chemical or neurochemical changes that result in the drive to use substances becoming a compulsion, and the changes in the neurochemistry, the pathways that are activated, and the depth of cravings that people experience.
Now, this is, I think, one of the areas where there's opportunity to take it too far. Like anything else, of course, moderation is the key. And are you of the view that somebody who experiences an addiction later in life was born that way? That there's a different variant on the human experience that makes somebody have an addiction later versus those who don't?
Absolutely not. I think addiction, like many psychiatric conditions, like many outcomes, is an extremely complex behavior or event or incident diagnosis. and that there are so many factors involved. Certainly genetics is one of them, but there are complex interactions between brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and a person's life experience that a person may or may not develop an addiction. I mean, if you go back many thousands of years, but we didn't have stimulants. You couldn't develop a stimulant use disorder because they didn't exist. So I think there's so many factors involved, but absolutely, it's not a determined outcome simply because one has genetic loading for it.
Yeah, and I feel like in some ways that's the entryway for stigma, because we hear this about all sorts of mental illnesses, right? That you're born that way, that your brain is just different or broken, or maybe not as crass of language, but that's kind of the kernel of some of these arguments. And I feel like that kind of biological determinism, it robs people of hope, that they feel like they're just the unlucky lot who happen to be like this, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I also think we all have the capacity to change our behavior with when we want and ready or need to. I don't. I think it's very complex, but I think the stigma comes from many places. I think our society views addiction as a weakness or a moral failing. I think it's very important to balance out that there are changes in the brain. There are so many drivers towards addiction that I think there are many values and there's many use and purpose to the medical model, to viewing it as a disease that can be studied, that can be understood, and that can be treated. I think that's key, that it's a chronic condition for which there is treatment, just the way there is for diabetes and for high blood pressure and other chronic conditions.
So you're a medical doctor, of course, and addiction is a diagnosis according to medical text. So do you consider addiction to be a disease?
Absolutely. I think it's a condition that's caused by neurochemical changes. Some are easier to see than others, depends on what you're measuring, but absolutely that it's there are consistent patterns, there are symptoms, there are presentations, and there are treatments for it. Some pharmacological, some psychological.
Yeah, this I feel like almost comes back to the nature-nurture debate, which I think anybody who's actually in any of these fields concerned, it's not really that debate at all. It's always both and, right? But I feel like in some ways it kind of comes back to that there's a camp of people who would say that addictions are not diseases, that they're problems of living, that they're social, that they're nurture. What would you say to that argument?
I guess I don't find that helpful, because to me it implies a great degree of choice. And I think there's perhaps the first time someone tries using substances, there is impulsivity involved. There may be the impression of choice. I think that I think commonly people look at people who use substances that the reason they use it is for the euphoria, for the high, because it's, I'll use the term, fun. So much of what I see is that people use substances to cope, either to cope with psychiatric symptoms or to cope with life circumstances. If a person has profound PTSD, flashbacks, nightmares, horrendous panic attacks triggered by memories of trauma, that substances are a way to escape from that. They're a way to cope when one doesn't have any other way to deal with those severe psychiatric symptoms. Alternatively, if a person is homeless, that's really awful. If a person uses crystal meth, it keeps them awake at night, which keeps them safer, which I think is a survival mechanism, and it suppresses appetite. It's cheaper to use crystal meth than to eat when you're homeless, and that's terrible. That's absolutely terrible. But I think there is a desperation for some people using substances that it's no longer a choice. It's not something they do out of lifestyle or just because. And I think it's so important to not attribute substance use simply to, I don't know if choice is the right word, that it may be the first few times, but I think in many cases people feel they have no choice. They have no alternatives in terms of coping with profound psychiatric symptoms or with escaping difficult environments.
Yeah. This really, too, I think, speaks to the adaptive function of the addiction, or the adaptive function really of any symptom or mental health struggle. And I've asked that of myself, and I've wondered that of others. What is the purpose of this? Not in the broader sense of, am I supposed to have this or supposed to go? There's nothing like that. But what function is this feeling serving? Is this disorder or disease even serving? Because I think in some ways that can empower you, or at least in my style of dealing with things, it empowers me to think, well, I'm struggling with this. I might as well learn something from it. I might as well do something with it. So what purpose could it be serving? Now, you also brought up a number of other conditions, and you're a specialist, a psychiatrist in concurrent disorders in particular. So you help people who have both a different mental illness and an addiction. I want to unpack that a little bit further, but let's start right here, because I don't think those two camps have always really gone together. Is addiction a mental illness?
Oh, absolutely. It's included in the DSM-5. There's a huge section on substance use disorders. I think in Canada, we have felt that psychiatrists I'll say traditionally limit their scope to non-substance use disorder mental illnesses, whereas there's increasing appreciation that the two overlap, that the prevalence of people with a mental disorder who use a substance, either comorbid to cope, which one makes the other one worse. I mean, there's a very high percentage of that. And in some cases, people with a mental health condition can use substances. For example, someone with severe anxiety will have a few drinks before they go out to a social situation. And in time, that can turn into an alcohol use disorder. It can be the other way around. Someone uses substances and develops a mental health problem. For example, using a stimulant like crystal meth, at some point, they'll begin to develop psychotic symptoms. And then sometimes those will resolve, but sometimes they can become permanent. There's so much debate on the interaction between cannabis use in adolescence and the development of schizophrenia. Does one predispose to the other? Is there an underlying factor that contributes to both? Does early use of cannabis make the development of a psychotic disorder worse or happen earlier? A lot of questions there, but clearly a relationship between the two.
Now, are there certain mental illnesses or conditions? I would imagine anything with psychosis is something you would particularly want to escape through substance use. So schizophrenia, maybe bipolar disorder. Are there particular conditions that you find disproportionately have concurrent disorders?
I see a highly selective population, right? I work in tertiary care hospital, so I see patients with addiction whose psychiatric illness is too severe for them to be treated in the addiction services in our community. And I see patients with psychiatric illness whose addiction is too severe to be managed in general psychiatry. I often see patients with a constellation of depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and a borderline personality construct who are using substances to cope with distressing emotions, with trauma, with that sort of constellation of things. I see patients with severe anxiety who use opioids or use alcohol to allow themselves to cope in social situations and cope with anxiety. But I see a huge range. It's quite a very mixed. That's not too trivial, but I see a wide range of substance use and of psychiatric disorders. It keeps work interesting, but it also keeps challenging.
Sure. Now I want to unpack. I'm just having so many thoughts and wondering if these things are myths or fact or not. So I want to just unpack a couple of them with you. The addictiveness of particular substances. I mean, you're a doctor. Are certain substances more addictive than others? You know, that it's been said that heroin, for example, you only need to use once. Is that actually true, or is it something about the psychology of the person who's using it and the level of need that they perceive that they have?
It's an interesting question. I think it's important to recognize that different substances work through different mechanisms, right? And there are a number of factors that influence the addictiveness of a substance, including the route, the time to onset, the experience, how long it lasts. The most addictive substance we have is nicotine. And one of the factors is it's such a short time lag between doing this and how quickly the nicotine gets to your brain. It's so rapid that people develop the connection to that. In most cases, very quickly. Substances with short-acting onset are more quickly and more rapidly become addictive. Do I see any strong connections between certain psychiatric disorders and addictions? I'd have to ask my colleagues in research. They keep track of the patients we see and try to look for patterns. I would say I see this constellation: depression, PTSD, borderline construct, alcohol, other substances as well. But there certainly are some patterns, but there's not one that stands out.
Now, you mentioned smoking, though, and I think this is really interesting, too, because I mentioned heroin, you mentioned smoking. This really raises an interesting question around the social construct of addiction, right? Certain substances you're considered an addict. I don't like that term. Of course, we need to use person-first language. But the predominant view, it seems, is a stigmatizing one, right? To separate the addicts out from everybody else. Anyway, the certain substances that you use, you're seen as an outcast from society. But others, like nicotine, like alcohol, social media, even seem to have similar addictive properties to them, but are much more socially accepted. And certain substances have moved between those. Psychedelics, for example, I think are currently doing that. Cannabis certainly has done that. So how much of how we see certain substances is a social construct that's sort of fluid in nature?
I think that's an interesting nature, and I think there's this idea that legal drugs are safer, which I think is a policy, right? Because tobacco and alcohol are by far our most damaging and costly substances when used in terms of high prevalence of use, and then the extensive costs in terms of healthcare costs, particularly for nicotine, right, and loss of life and impairments in health associated with smoking. Alcohol, huge cost with motor vehicle accidents while intoxicated, interpersonal violence while people are intoxicated, productivity loss. People can't go to work when they're hungover, and so we associate those with being somehow less toxic just because they're safe, because they're legal. And I think cannabis probably is less dangerous than nicotine. And now there's more, now that it's legal, there's a lot of more debate and discussion and examination of that. I think that's one of the reasons to push to decriminalize drugs, that it would be better to decriminalize and move the resources that are involved in criminal prosecution for people who own or are in possession of small amounts of opioids or stimulants for personal use, and move those resources and funds into treatment and helping people. I'm certainly not saying any of that is safe, but that I think it's become much more complex. It's not a legal, illegal. You are right about the social constructs and the reexamination, and different communities having different perspectives on the relative acceptance and tolerance of different things.
Yeah, and it comes down to really balancing the net good here, right? Are we doing more harm than good by incarcerating all of these people? And we know that the prisons have become the de facto asylums ever since many of the asylums have closed down. So there certainly has to be a better way, but I thank you and your colleagues for forging ahead for so long in trying to build that way. Dr. Jennifer Brasch is the lead in addiction psychiatry for St. Joe's Hospital. She's also the president of the Canadian Society of Addiction Medicine. Jen, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
We're almost out of time here, but before I let you go, I want to touch base quickly with just one more person. Lori Deacon is Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships and Practice Excellence for LifeWorks. Lori, thanks for stopping by today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, LifeWorks has a service that you're calling Influence Care. Tell me more about what that is and how people might be able to improve not only their mental health, but their physical health as well.
Absolutely. So Influence Care is a great service that we offer to bridge the gap essentially between the public system and the private system and have access to psychiatrists. So part of this service is really to ensure that people who are struggling from a mental health perspective, and we know there's been a lot of that happening from a pandemic perspective and even before that, to come in and play the role of an attending psychiatrist for one session, to come in, evaluate what your restrictions and limitations are, to evaluate whether you can continue working, whether you are able to return to work if you've been off of work, to establish if there's any non-medical barriers, and also to explore our daily functioning. So they go in and do this assessment for about an hour from a virtual perspective because we're in a virtual world. They go ahead and do that, and they're able to give a report for treatment recommendations that are usually medication-based, and also recommendations for psychotherapy afterwards. So it's this great service that kind of jettisons in to make sure that we support someone and send that information to their attending physician afterwards so that the attending physician has something, some sort of meat to go on to and make sure that they can actually manage their employees' health or their patients' health.
Oh, that sounds incredibly convenient and useful. So how can people get access to this service?
For sure. So right now, having access to this service is through your employer. So we have different partnerships with different employers where we are actually set up to be their provider from an influence care perspective. Typically it's attached to a disability management case, but we actually do have ad hoc services as well. So if this is something that employers are interested in offering to their employees to help them on their mental health journey, then we're definitely there to help them in that regard.
Wonderful. Laurie Deacon is Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships and Practice Excellence for LifeWorks. Thanks so much for being here, Laurie.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
That's it for us this week on Living Well. Thank you to all of my guests today, and thank you, as always, for listening. You can like and subscribe to Living Well wherever you're listening or watching today: YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else the podcasts are found. You can go back and get all of our past episodes from our 3 seasons so far on any of those platforms, as well as at livingwellpod.com. You can connect with me directly on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube at Mark Hennick, and let me know what you thought about our conversation today. Until next time, this has been the LifeWorks Living Well podcast. I've been your host, Mark Hennick. Take care and live well.